Have you ever experienced the sensation that your identity feels like a performance you can no longer maintain, as though the persona the world recognizes is disintegrating, yet something deep within you whispers, this is necessary? What if your ego's collapse isn't your destruction, but rather the emergence of something profoundly authentic, something your nervous system has desperately needed and your soul has quietly arranged? Here is what rarely gets discussed. Your ego wasn't designed for happiness. It was engineered for survival. That is precisely why ego death, despite being frightening, can feel like finally releasing a breath you've held for decades. But what truly occurs in your brain and consciousness following ego death? And how did Carl Jung articulate this phenomenon long before neuroscience validated it? Stay with me, because this exploration will reveal not only what ego death does to your neural pathways, but why it might be exactly what your mental well-being requires, and why the aspect of you resisting this transformation is simultaneously the part yearning for it most. We exist in a culture where ego gets casually mentioned everywhere. Someone's egotistical, release your ego. But what does it actually mean? Psychologically, your ego represents the constructed identity you built to navigate society. It is the self you believe yourself to be, composed of narratives, classifications, childhood patterns, and social facades. Most of it developed without your conscious awareness. Carl Jung termed this the persona, our public face. Beneath that facade, he explained, exists the shadow, every disowned fragment of yourself sacrificed for acceptance, validation, or security. Your ego grips that mask desperately, treating it as essential for survival, because from the ego's perspective, it absolutely is. Now here is where things become fascinating. According to fMRI research on meditation and psychedelic substances, published in prestigious journals, including Nature and Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, when subjects experience ego dissolution, measurable neurological changes occur. The default mode network, the brain region governing self, referential cognition, and your internal narrator, shows dramatically reduced activity. This identical network demonstrates hyperactivity in individuals struggling with anxiety and depression. It generates thoughts like, I'm inadequate, what if I'm rejected, or I must maintain control. When ego starts dissolving, whether through intended meditation, breathwork, psychedelic journeys, or spiritual emergence, it transcends philosophical abstraction. It becomes a biological phenomenon. This biological unraveling feels catastrophic because your brain equates identity with survival. When the facade crumbles, your nervous system responds with alarm. It resembles death, but it isn't. It is the dissolution of an inauthentic self. What follows ego death? Once that psychological mask vanishes, does your brain permanently restructure itself? Can ego death genuinely resolve trauma? And how did Carl Jung describe this transformation decades before neuroscience possessed terminology for it? That is our next exploration. But first, if you're passionate about consciousness expansion and investigating life's deeper dimensions, subscribe to Fractal Wisdom so you never miss content that challenges perceived limitations. Stay through to the conclusion, because later we'll unveil practical methodologies to safely navigate ego death and harness its potential for healing, creativity, and spiritual development. You've just endured what resembles an internal earthquake. Your ego, that persistent voice demanding narrative control, has fallen silent, perhaps disappeared entirely. You're uncertain whether you've achieved liberation or sanity is slipping away. But here is the paradox neuroscience now confirms. When your ego dissolves, your brain doesn't fracture. It initiates healing. What happens subsequently might explain why countless individuals report extraordinary peace, lucidity, and even euphoria following ego death. Because underneath your identity static, a deeper intelligence awaits emergence. When the default mode network quiets, whether through meditation, psychedelics, near-death experiences, or intensive breath work, something remarkable activates. Neural connectivity across brain regions increases exponentially. Researchers at Imperial College London labeled this entropic brain activity. Essentially, your brain establishes unprecedented connections, like orchestra instruments suddenly improvising harmoniously for the first time. Your sense of self becomes fluid, expansive. You begin recognizing perhaps you're not merely your thoughts, but the awareness observing them. Research published in Frontiers in Psychology demonstrated that more intense ego dissolution experiences correlate with greater long-term reductions in depression and anxiety. Consider that carefully. The brain essentially undergoes a reset. Carl Jung would have identified this as confronting the self, capital S, confronting the self, capital She. The expansive, wiser dimension of your psyche obscured by ego-driven fear programming. This isn't merely poetic mysticism. Genuine biological transformation occurs. Studies examining long-term meditators and psilocybin therapy reveal increased prefrontal cortex activity, the brain region responsible for empathy, insight, and emotional regulation. Simultaneously, amygdala activity decreases, the structure processing fear and threat following ego death. The brain becomes less reactive, more contemplative. You're less trapped in patterns like, I'm insufficient, or they'll criticize me, and more present with what actually exists, not what your mind fabricates. This sounds profoundly transformative, but here is the unsettling question rarely addressed. If you dissolve the ego, what remains? Who are you without the stories, identity markers, accomplishments, or familiar pain? Is there danger in excessive self-dissolution? Can you venture too far without returning? This is where Carl Jung's insights become essential, because he cautioned that dismantling the ego without integration could prove as hazardous as never confronting it. What does integration actually look like? How do you reconstruct an identity aligned with your authentic self, not your trauma, not your conditioning? That is our next destination. We'll explore how Carl Jung's individuation concept provides the missing framework modern neuroscience is only beginning to map, and how you can cultivate a wiser, more compassionate sense of self after ego death. This phase is critical because transformation without grounding resembles chaos. If you felt disoriented during spiritual awakening or mental health journeys, this understanding might provide clarity. The ego has unraveled, the mask removed. You've glimpsed deeper truth beneath the noise, and perhaps for the first time, you're uncertain of your true identity. This terrifies, not because it is harmful, but because it is unfamiliar, like awakening in your lifelong home, suddenly noticing every wall painted differently and doors relocated. The question becomes, now what? If the ego was never your authentic self yet facilitated survival, how do you re-enter the world after ego death? Not as your former self, but as something more complete and vital. Carl Jung called this journey individuation, and understanding it may distinguish healing from fragmentation. Carl Jung wasn't simply a psychologist. He was a mystic with scientific rigor. He believed the human psyche isn't inherently broken, but layered. Peeling back those layers reveals not emptiness, but meaning. He described individuation as becoming your genuine self, not others' expectations, not the people-pleasing persona, but the integrated whole, shadow and light, conscious and unconscious, all aspects unified. This journey typically begins after, because only then are we compelled to ask, who am I truly? That is not rhetorical, it is an invitation to rebuild. Not the ego as it was, but as it can become, a healthy bridge between inner and outer worlds, a self-version listening to soul wisdom, not merely fear. Neuroscientifically, this rebuilding involves neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire through new experiences. After ego death, neural patterns previously operating automatically, patterns shaped by trauma, social roles, or outdated beliefs, get disrupted. Within that disruption, new patterns can form supporting this process through mindfulness, therapy, creative practices, or spiritual reflection literally reshapes how your brain processes identity, emotion, and connection. This explains why post-ego death periods often bring heightened intuition, increased empathy, reduced thought identification, meaning seeking, and deeper creativity and unconscious connection. However, ignoring or suppressing this phase, attempting premature normalcy, can trigger existential confusion, derealization, or spiritual bypassing. That is why Jung emphasized integration. You've seen behind the curtain and cannot unsee it, but you can construct a new way of being, incorporating what you've learned rather than avoiding it. Here is the revelation. Jung believed the self, your deepest essence, desires this wholeness. It summons you through the exact breakdowns you thought were destroying your life, panic attacks, burnout, creative blocks, identity crises. What if those weren't failures but invitations? What if your ego didn't die because you were broken, but because you were finally prepared to awaken? How do you integrate this awakening? How do you live after ego death, having recognized old rules no longer apply and new ones remain unwritten? That is our next exploration. We'll examine tools supported by psychology and neuroscience that help rewire your nervous system, reconnect with your body, and rebuild a life aligned with your higher self. Because this journey doesn't conclude with ego death. That is merely the beginning. What follows is the genuine adventure. You've confronted the dissolution of everything you believed yourself to be. You've tasted the raw, overwhelming stillness following ego dissolution. But you cannot remain in that void. Integration isn't optional. It distinguishes awakening from psychological fragmentation. While ego death feels like an ending, what follows is actually rebirth. But rebirth requires care, intentional practices supporting your nervous system, mind and soul as they reorganize around a new existence mode. Here are 4 powerful integration tools. First, somatic grounding, healing through embodiment. Understand this clearly. Trauma doesn't reside in thoughts. It lives in. That is why merely intellectualizing your spiritual awakening or ego death often provides no relief. Your body feels overwhelmed, unsafe, dysregulated. It needs movement, expression, discharge. This is somatic grounding. Your body is designed to complete stress cycles, but modern culture teaches suppression. Stay still, appear calm, be polite. Yet in nature, animals shake after trauma. They tremble, stretch, vocalize. They release. We can too. Try intuitive movement or ecstatic dance. Move as though your body is communicating. Shake everything for 2 to 3 minutes. Practice breathwork like Wim Hof or box breathing to regulate your vagus nerve. Try trampolining. Cold exposure like ice baths or cold showers to reset your system. Stretch with sound, groan, sigh, hum. Release trapped energy, chant or tone. Vocal vibrations stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. Walk barefoot in nature, hit pillows or visit rage rooms. Yes, that counts. These work because your nervous system communicates through sensation, not logic. By permitting your body to physically complete stress cycles, you signal your brain, we're safe now. Only then can genuine rebuilding begin. Second, shadow work journaling, allowing the hidden to speak. You might be tempted to remain in light now that you've transcended ego, but authentic growth requires facing what still hides in darkness. That is shadow work. Jung taught that the shadow contains everything you reject or repress: jealousy, control issues, shame, desires. These aspects aren't evil, just misunderstood. Until you acknowledge them, they'll unconsciously control your life. Ask, what is this resentment protecting? What discomforts me in others that I haven't owned in myself? What emotion have I avoided feeling this week? If journaling feels difficult, don't force it. Some people are more verbal. Try voice recording your thoughts instead. Simply speak them aloud, like conversing with your inner world. The goal isn't fixing anything, it is witnessing, because what you can name, what you avoid, strengthens in darkness. Third, archetypal awareness, meeting your inner caste. This is powerful yet often overlooked. Carl Jung believed your psyche comprises archetypes, universal energies or patterns appearing in every culture, myth and dream. These aren't merely stories, they're living forces within you. After ego death, these archetypes often emerge more clearly because the ego no longer suppresses them. You might feel the inner child craving protection or play, the warrior pushing you to reclaim power, the mystic asking you to trust the unknown, the caregiver urging you to soften and serve, the trickster tempting self-sabotage or absurdist laughter, the sage whispering truths in stillness. Instead of resisting them, dialogue with these inner energies. Ask yourself which archetype is dominant today. What does it need? What truth is it revealing? When you understand you're not one static self, but an evolving cast of inner characters, life becomes more spacious and self-compassion easier. Fourth, conscious connection. Healing through safe human mirrors. After ego death, your inner world is wide open. You're raw, redefined, more perceptive than ever, but also more vulnerable. That is why conscious connection is among the most overlooked, yet powerful integration tools. Here is the paradox. Ego death often leads to solitude. But healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in relationship. Our nervous systems co-regulate. Around safe, attuned, grounded people, our bodies mirror that stability. This connects to polyvagal theory, especially the ventral vagal state supporting calm connection and social engagement. The right relationships can literally help rewire your nervous system after ego death. This isn't about overwhelming anyone with your revelations. It is about choosing intentional spaces where your emerging self can be seen, accepted, and compassionately mirrored back. Practice this through open-hearted conversations with someone who understands, not to fix you, but witness you. Join conscious community spaces like support circles, integration groups, spiritual sanghas, or therapeutic circles. Work with trauma, informed coaches, guides or therapists familiar with awakening. Even having one person you can text saying, I feel different, can I share what is happening? Matters because when ego dissolves, it can feel like nobody sees you anymore, not even yourself. But being held in loving connection reminds you, you're not disappearing, you're emerging, being met by another human while you're still forming. That is medicine. If you've experienced ego death or even glimpses of it, you're not broken. You're in a sacred in-between. It is acceptable to lack all the answers right now. What matters most, you don't have to return to who you were. You get to rebuild with intention, truth, and gentleness. These tools aren't merely practices. They're lifelines back to your body, your intuition, your authentic self. I want to hear from you. What aspect of your ego have you recently released? Or perhaps you're in it now, between stories, between identities, between who you were and who you're becoming. This is space for genuine no masks required. If you found this video healing or illuminating, subscribe to Fractal Wisdom. This channel supports your expansion mentally, emotionally, spiritually, with tools meeting you where you are. More is coming, and you won't want to miss what is next. You're not alone on this path. We're walking it together.